Alright guys, today we're going to be talking about this rock star Kim Jong-un. He is the leader in the fight against global warming / climate change. Look at these women fawning all over him. These are some of the biggest climate change activists in the world. And there they are surrounding their god, their legend. And this guy is saving the planet. Other world leaders could learn a thing or two from this guy. The other leaders, they just talk a lot of crap. You've got people like Al Gore flying in private jets all over the world. Meanwhile, in North Korea, this guy is actually doing more than just talking. He is taking action and he is leading the fight. So I just want to highlight this in this video, that Kim Jong-un is the world leader in the fight against global warming. So we're going to be looking at some graphs and stats and looking at some images just to prove that this guy is the hero I'm claiming him to be. Now let's have a look at this image just to start off. Here he is surrounded by some male climate change activists from North Korea. Now look at that serious look in his face, and all these other guys. They are serious about the fight against global warming. And look at his face here. He's got a big smile surrounded by the women. So I think we know where he stands. I know which team he's playing for. But let's move on to serious business. Actually, let's just look at this picture here before we move on. This is Kim Jong-un's sister. So our last bit of eye candy here before we move on to serious business. People say that she may take over from her fat brother, but we're going to have to see about that. I mean, look at these women fawning all over this guy. He's the hero. He's the legend. And here we have his sister looking pretty good there. And out of all these women, I would have to pick this one. This one looks like the cutest. But okay, I promise we'll get down to business. Let's go. Let's do this. So here is CO2 emissions per capita. So we're looking at countries per person. And on top we have Qatar. Now Qatar is a small country. But look at the emissions per capita. 37.29 tons per person in Qatar. Now here's the average, 4.79. So a little under 5 tons per person. And we have Montenegro high up, Kuwait, Trinidad and Tobago, the UAE. Now let's have a look at some notable countries here. The United States ranked 16th. Their emissions are over 15 tons per person. So the United States is number 2. So these numbers here on the left is the total CO2 output per person in total. So the United States ranks number 2 in the world for total emissions, but per person they're only ranked 16th. Now, it's still pretty high up. The US is a big CO2 emitter per person. And if we scroll on here, we're going to see Russia's pretty high up. Japan, Germany, Finland. We have Ireland. And China here. So China, the number 1 emitter. China, the world's largest population. And they emit 7.38 tons per person. Now that's about half of what the United States is per person. So let's keep scrolling down. We got France here. France is 5.13 tons per person. I'm going to go back to France later and compare it to Germany. Let's go down here. Here we go. So we have North Korea, 53rd largest emitter and 2.32 tons per person. So looking at this here, you could argue, well, North Korea is not number 1 because there's lots of other countries underneath North Korea that has less CO2 emissions per person. And it's the 53rd highest emitter in the world in total. But if we scroll down here, we see a lot of really poor countries, underdeveloped countries. And I'm going to be taking a look at these countries in more detail because it's not what it seems from this graph or this list. Because these countries, now they may have very small emissions per person, but we're going to see how it's changing for these countries. A lot of African countries here towards the bottom. And we have Greenland at the very bottom, 0.03 tons per person. Faroe Islands. So I'm going to look at some of these countries one by one to give you an idea of what the hell is going on. And we're going to start with China. So China is the biggest emitter Per person, it's down a bit, but look at these emissions year by year. And we're going to see that China is a huge problem in the world, because we can see how it's just increased like hugely from like the early 90s. It's just exploded. And if we look at India, actually, let's go back to China a second. We can see that it's kind of leveled off for China. So we have to give them a bit of kudos here. It's leveled off a bit. But if we go to India, look at this. It's just growing steadily. And India is probably going to overtake China in terms of population. And their carbon emissions are still just going through the roof. And it's just growing year by year. Now the United States, now look at the US. So US has faced a lot of criticism. But if you look at their emissions, it's kind of leveled off. Look at this graph. It's gone up slightly since the 80s, and then it's gone down a bit here since like the turn of the millennium. It's kind of gone down. So the US is doing better. Now I want to look at France here. So France, 5.13 tons per capita. So that's 3 times less than the US. So French people are emitting 1/3 the CO2 of people from the US. So this is why the US gets a lot of criticism, because they compare the US to European countries. These are all developed countries. So why is France like just 1/3 of the US? But now let's look at Germany. Germany is 9.44 per capita. Now you can see the trend has gone downwards, and for France it's similar. It's kind of gone down since the 70s. So France and Germany are doing good in terms of the overall emissions going down, and likewise the US, though not quite as impressive. But this is what I wanted to point out to you. Germany is 9.44 per capita and France is 5.13. So France is just over half the emissions of Germans. So why is it that German people are emitting close to double of France? And this is something you don't hear much about. You hear people ragging on the US, but why is Germany almost double that of France? Now I'm going to move on to Africa. So Africa, I'm going to start with Nigeria. Now Nigeria has the largest population in Africa. And look at their emissions. It's gone up, but not by a massive margin. So Nigeria is doing pretty well. But if we look at some other African countries, we see a completely different story. Let's look at Tanzania. So Tanzania has just exploded with carbon emissions. Like back in the 80s, 70s, it was pretty low. And then in the 90s, it started to go up. And then in the last 20 odd years, it's just absolutely exploded. And it's similar for Ethiopia. We see a huge explosion. Now, this coincides with population explosions, because some of these countries have just exploded in population. Now, look at the tons per capita. So per person, it's still really low, but like 0.1 for Ethiopia, 0.18 for Tanzania. Now, Nigeria is higher, but it's still pretty low compared to most places, 0.44. And we're going to look at Egypt here. Their tons per capita is a lot higher than the sub-Saharan countries we just looked at. But again, the trend continues. It's just an explosion. So interestingly, Nigeria, with the highest population in Africa, has kind of leveled off. But these other countries, they're just exploding with CO2 emissions. And let's go back here. We're going to look at the top polluter per person is Qatar. This is their graph. And like most of the African countries we looked at, it's just absolutely exploded. Now I want to go down here to the bottom, because we mentioned earlier that Greenland is the lowest. Now I want to show you this graph, and this is why I tell you, just be very wary of statistics in general. Their emissions are 0.03 per person, but look at why are all these colored in black? Because it's all non-combustion. By this graph, we are led to believe that Greenland has no transport emissions whatsoever. No emissions from buildings, no emissions from other industries, power industry. Now, if we go back to Nigeria here, we see a mixture of stuff here. The United States, Again, a mixture from transport, buildings, power industry, non-combustion. India the same, and in China. So I'm very suspicious of this, that Greenland supposedly has no emissions from any of these power industries, transport, or buildings. That seems weird to me. That's something maybe I'll do in another video to find out what the hell is going on there. But I want to show you this map here. So here's a map of the Korean Peninsula. We have North Korea in red, South Korea in yellow. And here we have a satellite image. Now here is South Korea. Here is North Korea. Now look at the difference in the light. So this is taken at night. We have a huge blob of light here. This is Seoul, South Korea, the capital. And here we have a little bit of light here, North Korea. That's Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. So here it is on the map. And here is Seoul. And you can see how they line up here. And you can see the border here just by the light. You can see the border between the two Koreas. And you can see the Chinese border with North Korea here. Kim Jong-un doesn't believe in light pollution or any kind of carbon emissions here. Look at this. This is why Kim Jong-un is a hero. And here is another image here. This looks like it was touched up a bit, but here you can see the stark contrast between North Korea and South Korea. Here's Pyongyang, really just about the only place in North Korea that has light. We see a couple of other cities here dotted around the map. But look at South Korea. Look how lit up it is, especially here in the northwest where Seoul is. Some other big cities here. So now I want to show you North Korea's graph. So this is where we can see just how much of a hero Kim Jong-un is. This is North Korea's graph, and look at how much they've reduced their carbon emissions. Back in the late 70s to the mid 80s, this is where North Korea peaked with carbon emissions. They were putting out 150 million tons, close to that in the 80s, and now they're like way down to 50 million odd. So they've reduced their carbon emissions by down to like 1/3 of what it used to be almost. Even though their tons per capita is higher than some other countries, especially in Africa, this graph is the best graph you'll see in terms of a country really cutting down on its peak carbon emissions. This graph, look how much it goes down here. So this is why this man is a rock star. And I think, people should be worshipping this guy and not people like Al Gore or Greta Thunberg. These women, they know where it's at. These women, they know who the real hero is. So guys, if you want to talk about climate change and global warming, you can't have this conversation without mentioning this guy. I'm going to be doing more videos about global warming, climate change, and population and all that other stuff. So subscribe, like the video, comment. Let me know what you think about this guy. See you guys later.